Picture this. You are walking across a deserted heath. It is the 18th century. Wild, overgrown. The wind is just howling through the tall grass. Your foot strikes a stone. You pick it aside.
Right, because it is just a stone. Nature is full of them.
Exactly. But then a few steps later, your foot strikes something else. A watch. You pick it up. You see the glass face, the brass gears clicking perfectly into place, the coiled springs storing energy.
You certainly do not look at that watch and think, well, the wind and rain really did a number on this piece of metal to shape it like this.
No, you assume immediately, actually, that there was a watchmaker. Complexity implies a designer. That is the famous intuition from the theologian William Paley. It feels like common sense. But what happens when someone takes that intuition, that comfortable feeling that someone is in charge, and completely shatters it?
That is where Richard Dawkins enters the chat. He picks up that watch, which for him represents the human eye, or a bat's wing, and he says, yes, there is a watchmaker. But he isn't watching. He has no plan. He has no foresight. He is blind.
And that brings us to the focus of today's discussion. We are unpacking the book, The Blind Watchmaker, by Richard Dawkins. But before we get into the gears and springs of his argument, I want to set the stage properly. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. More than just a summary, which we also include, this feature examines how the author shapes argument, builds influence, and earns or loses your trust, giving you the tools to read with sharper insight and greater discernment. Should you read this book, this should help. Also excellent for aspiring writers. If you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback helps guide our future content.
And just so you know who is guiding you through this, you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
So let's get into the why of this book. Because The Blind Watchmaker isn't just a biology textbook. This analysis describes it as a carefully engineered rhetorical campaign. It sounds highly calculated. What was the mission here?
It was incredibly calculated because Dawkins felt the walls closing in. You have to look at the urgency of the moment. This hits shelves in 1986. In the U.S. specifically, there was this massive resurgence of creationism, and something called scientific creationism was actually getting into school curriculums.
So he viewed this as a cultural emergency, essentially.
100%. He saw it as a retreat from reason. He isn't writing this just as an Oxford academic. He is writing it as a defender of scientific literacy. So throughout the text, he's wearing two hats. On one side, he's the objective zoologist presenting data, but on the other, he is a passionate, almost militant advocate for scientific naturalism.
And that seems to be where the tension in the book really lives. He is trying to juggle two very different audiences, right? He wants to fascinate the general reader, people like us who just think science is cool, but he also wants to absolutely dismantle the skeptic or the religious believer.
Right, and those are two very different goals. One requires wonder, the other requires warfare. As the analysis suggests, his success really depends on which side of that line you are standing on when you open the book.
Let's start with the wonder part, the core argument. Because the title, The Blind Watchmaker, is such a direct jab at Paley. But looking at a human eye or a hummingbird's wing, it is genuinely hard to believe it just happened. What is the actual mechanism he is proposing to replace the idea of a designer?
Well, Dawkins would actually agree with you. It didn't just happen. Not by random chance. That is the biggest misconception he tries to clear up. He draws a hard line between single-step chance and cumulative selection.
Okay, help me visualize that. What is the difference?
Single-step chance is like, well, imagine shaking a box of scrap metal and hoping a Boeing 747 falls out, fully assembled. It is statistically impossible. The numbers are too big. You would be shaking that box until the heat death of the universe and still just have scrap metal.
Right. Totally impossible.
But cumulative selection is different. It is about a sieve. Imagine you are trying to crack a combination lock. Single-step selection means you have to guess the whole 10-digit code at once. Impossible. Cumulative selection implies that every time you get one digit right, the lock clicks and holds that number. You keep the progress.
So in biology, that click is survival.
Precisely. If a tiny genetic change gives an organism a 1% improvement, say a patch of skin that is slightly sensitive to light, that trait helps it survive. It reproduces. The lock holds that digit. Then the next generation builds on it. Over millions of years, you do not need luck to build an eye. You just need time and a filter.
The analysis highlights his example of the eye here, which I found fascinating because that is always the classic counterargument. Like, what good is 5% of an eye?
For the idea that an eye is all or nothing, Dawkins tears that apart. He asks, is 5% vision useless? If you are in a cave with a predator and you can distinguish light from shadow,
Yeah.
and the other guy cannot,
Don't win. You survive.
you survive 100% of the time. 5% vision is infinitely better than 0. And from there, you can ramp up to 10%, to a blurry lens, to a sharp lens. He shows that there's a smooth, uphill ramp from no eye to a camera eye.
He applies the same logic to bats, right? I loved that section. He basically treats the bat like a piece of military hardware.
It is brilliant.
Yeah.
He approaches it as an engineering problem. He says, okay, if you are an engineer and you need to navigate in total darkness, what do you build? You cannot use light. You have to use sound. You need a transmitter, a receiver, and a computer to calculate the Doppler shift.
And then he reveals nature beat us to it.
By millions of years, he describes bat sonar as this incredible feat of good design. But, and here's the kicker, he argues this design does not require a designer. It just requires the ruthless filter of natural selection operating over deep time.
So that is the what of the book, the biology. But I want to shift to the how. This is where the source material calls Dawkins a genius of strategy. They call his use of the watchmaker metaphor a stunning act of argumentative judo.
It really is. Think about what he did. He did not ignore Paley's watch. He did not say, well, that is a stupid analogy. He stole it.
He hijacked the branding.
He co-opted the opponent's strongest weapon.
Yeah.
He accepts the premise. Yes, life looks designed. It looks like a watch. That validates the reader's intuition. But then he redirects that energy. He says, keep the watch, but realize the watchmaker is physics, not a person. It gives the reader a mental anchor they are already comfortable with, then swaps the label.
He also uses something that was pretty cutting edge for 1986 computers. I was surprised to read about the biomorphs. This wasn't just a thought experiment. He actually coded this, right?
He did. And remember, 1986 computers were not exactly generating high-end graphics, but he wrote a program to simulate evolutionary branching. He created these stick-figure creatures on the screen. He called them biomorphs.
And how did the program work? Like, what did he actually do?
He introduced random mutations in the drawing instructions. And then he, as the user, acted as natural selection. He would pick the offspring that looked interesting and breed from that. In just a few generations, he got things that looked like insects, trees, even Spitfire airplanes.
Why was this so effective rhetorically? Why did he include it in the book?
Because it transformed evolution from an abstract theory into something you could see. As the authors of our analysis explained, this blends logos, the logic of the code, with experience. It showed people that simple rules could generate complex, unexpected shapes without anyone drawing the final product by hand. It made the invisible visible. It takes the magic out of creation and replaces it with procedure.
That leads us to the emotional side of the book. We usually think of science books as dry, facts, data, Latin names. But the analysis mentions Dawkins uses a specific kind of pathos or emotion. He calls it the rational sublime.
This is one of his superpowers. He refuses to let religion have a monopoly on awe. When he describes DNA or the mechanism of a bat's wing, he writes with this deep reverence. He wants to show the reader that reality, the cold, hard scientific view, is actually more magical and wondrous than any myth.
It is the idea that the truth is stranger and more beautiful than fiction.
Precisely. He wants you to feel the staggeringly high information density of a single cell and think, wow, it appeals to our intellectual vanity too. We want to be the ones who see the real beauty of the universe, unclouded by superstition. It makes the reader feel part of an elite club of those who truly know.
It is very seductive. You feel smart reading it.
Exactly. And that is part of the strategy.
Speaking of analyzing the world around us, let's take a brief pause for mindful moments. Our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought.
It is definitely a great resource to keep these conversations going.
Okay, we're back. We have talked about the brilliance of the metaphor, the biomorphs, and the beauty of the science. But we need to look at the other side of the coin. The source analysis points out a critical distinction. While the biology in the book is generally considered sound, the philosophy and the tone are, well, let's say, vulnerable.
This is where the book becomes controversial, and frankly, where it potentially fails its mission. The sources note that Dawkins can be incredibly combative. He doesn't just disagree with creationists, he sometimes dismisses them as dishonest religious bigots.
Ouch. That seems counterproductive if you're trying to change minds.
It is a major rhetorical flaw. The analysis argues that this tone alienates the very secondary audience he ostensibly wants to reach. If you are a religious reader coming to this book with an open mind, and you get hit with insults, you are likely to shut down. He energizes his base, the secular readers, but he builds a wall against everyone else.
Let's look at the logical fallacies identified in the analysis. One that stood out to me was the straw man argument regarding personal incredulity. Can you break that down?
Sure. The argument from personal incredulity is basically when someone says, I cannot personally believe or imagine how this complex I could have evolved by chance, therefore it didn't. Dawkins spends a lot of time knocking this down.
Which seems fair, right? Just because I am not smart enough to imagine it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
It is fair in principle.
Yeah.
But critics note that Dawkins applies this label a bit too broadly. He tends to treat all philosophical objections to his worldview as just people being incredulous or not smart enough to get it. He sometimes sidesteps the more sophisticated philosophical challenges by pretending they're just simple-minded disbelief. It creates a straw man where every opponent is just ignorant rather than philosophically nuanced.
There's another Latin phrase that popped up in the analysis. Argumentum ad ignorantium. I assume that means argument from ignorance.
Spot on. In the book, Dawkins effectively suggests that because there is no scientifically testable alternative to natural selection must be the answer by default.
Wait, isn't that how science works? You go with the best theory you have until a better one comes along.
Scientifically, yes. It is the only honest position to take in the lab. But philosophically, as a proof of how the universe works, it is weak. Just because we haven't found another explanation doesn't logically prove that this specific explanation accounts for absolutely everything. It creates a subtle but important logical gap. He frames it as a closed case, when philosophically it is still an open inquiry.
This brings us to the cosmic Darwinism critique. I found this the most fascinating part of the analysis. The philosopher Dallas Willard is mentioned here. He points out a problem with the starting line.
This is arguably the most significant philosophical vulnerability in the book. Dawkins explains beautifully how the watchmaker works once life exists. Once you have a self-replicating molecule, natural selection takes over and drives complexity.
But where did the replicator come from?
Exactly. That is the circular reasoning. He assumes the existence of the initial order, the chemistry, the physics, the first replicator necessary to get the process started.
It is like explaining how a car race works. The strategy, the speed, the winners. But never explaining who built the engines or paved the track.
That is a great analogy. He explains the race perfectly, but he assumes the track and the cars just appeared. And to be fair, he addresses this slightly in the book, but he mostly waves it away as a lucky chemical accident that only had to happen once.
For a book that claims to dispel all design, leaving the very origin of life to luck or unknown chemistry, feels like a pretty big gap.
It is. He is essentially saying, give me one miracle the first cell, and I can explain the rest without miracles. But that first step is a doozy. He successfully explains the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. And the sources point out that this is where he steps out of biology and into philosophy, or as they call it, cosmic Darwinism.
The analysis also mentions a false dichotomy. It feels like Dawkins gives you two choices. You are either a rational Darwinian naturalist or you are a superstitious religious person.
Yes, he frames the world as Darwinian naturalism or religious superstition. He ignores the vast philosophical middle ground.
Right, because there are plenty of people who accept evolution as the mechanism.
Exactly. There are many thinkers who accept evolution as biological fact, but don't accept that it rules out purpose, meaning, or even a higher power initiating the laws of physics. Dawkins collapses those nuances. He forces a choice that might not actually be necessary. He wants you to believe that if you accept the biology, you must accept his atheism. And logically, that doesn't follow.
It feels like he is trying to bundle his science with his worldview. Like if you buy the phone, you have to buy the carrier plan too.
That is a perfect way to put it. The science is excellent. The carrier plan, the atheistic philosophy is optional, but he sells them as a package deal.
So if we synthesize all of this, the brilliant metaphors, the rational sublime, but also the combative tone and the philosophical leaps, what is the verdict?
The honest assessment from our sources is really a split decision.
Let's break it down by audience, for the choir.
For the scientifically sympathetic reader, the book is a masterpiece. It is clear, it is memorable, and it provides that intellectual beauty we talked about. It validates their worldview with hard science. It gives them the ammunition they were looking for in 1986 and arguably still are today.
And for the skeptic, or even just the neutral reader,
it largely fails to persuade. The analysis suggests it substitutes rhetorical confidence for logical completeness. The aggressive tone and the philosophical gaffes give a skeptic too many reasons to say, well, he doesn't actually have all the answers. He's just shouting louder.
It seems like the key takeaway here is distinguishing between the information and the understanding.
That is the critical distinction. The information, how bat sonar works, how DNA replicates, how cumulative selection functions, is sound. It is mainstream science. But the understanding, he asks you to accept that this biology proves there is no purpose in the universe. That is a philosophical leap. It goes beyond the strict evidence.
So the book is a fortress when it comes to biology, but maybe a bit of a glass house when it comes to philosophy.
I think that is a fair way to put it. It is most powerful as a defense of evolutionary mechanisms and most vulnerable as a work of cosmic philosophy.
And that is a perfect place to leave you with a final thought. We often read books like The Blind Watchmaker, hoping for a definitive answer to the biggest questions. But maybe the real value isn't in accepting Dawkins' conclusion wholesale.
No, the value's in the friction.
Right. Ask yourself, can you separate the science from the rhetoric? Can you appreciate the mechanics of the watch without necessarily accepting the author's view on the watchmaker? That is the challenge of being a discerning reader. It is about understanding the argument without being swept away by the campaign.
And realizing that appreciating the complexity of life doesn't always require agreeing on its origin.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
Absolutely. It is all about reading actively.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.